The cold was a living thing in the North Tower. It seeped through the stone, through the thin wool of her tunic, and settled deep in her bones. Alara felt it as a constant ache, a reminder of what she was. Nothing. A scullion with hands raw from lye soap, and a stomach that rumbled with a hollow, familiar pain. Her task was the worst in the castle, a punishment disguised as a duty. Every night, after the great hall had feasted and the kitchens were finally quieting, she was given the bucket. It was filled with the dregs, the gnawed bones and gristle, the scraps no one else would touch. She was to take it to the beast. No one ever said its name. It was just the beast in the tower, a story whispered by maids to frighten new girls, a growl that sometimes echoed from the high, barred window on nights of the full moon. They said it was the Alpha King's monster, a creature of such rage that he kept it chained in the darkness, a living weapon he refused to unleash. The guards at the base of the tower never looked at her. They just unlocked the heavy oak door and shoved her through, their eyes filled with a mixture of pity and disgust. She was the girl who fed the monster, as disposable as the scraps in her bucket. The winding stairs were slick with damp and something she tried not to think about. The air grew colder with every step, thick with the scent of old stone, decay, and something else. Something wild and musky and profoundly lonely. It was the smell of predator, but also of pain. The cell was at the very top. A slab of iron with a slot at the bottom was its only door. For the first 10 nights, that was all she did. Shove the bucket through the slot, listen to the scrape of it being dragged across the stone, and then flee back down the stairs, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She never saw it. She only heard the wet, desperate sounds of its eating. But on the 11th night, something was different. The usual silence was broken by a low sound, a pained whine that was almost too deep to be heard. Felt more as a vibration in the stone floor. It wasn't a sound of hunger. It was a sound of suffering. Curiosity was a luxury she couldn't afford, a thing that had been beaten out of her long ago. Yet, she hesitated. Her hand hovered over the bucket. The beast inside had not eaten in 11 days. The kitchens had been in a frenzy preparing for the winter solstice feast, and in the chaos, the scraps had been thrown to the dogs or burned. No one had remembered the beast. No one but her. She had saved her own ration, a lump of hard, dark bread and a sliver of cheese. A treasure she had planned to eat slowly over 2 days. It was all she had. The whine came again, sharper this time, ending in a rattling cough that shook the iron door. She thought of being hungry. She thought of being alone in the dark, in the cold, in pain. For the first time, she felt not fear, but a strange, aching kinship with the creature in the cell. Her fingers trembled as she slid the bolt on the small Judas window set in the door, a feature she'd never been brave enough to touch. The metal was colder than ice. She lifted the small grate and peered into the oppressive darkness within. At first, she saw nothing, just shadows. Then, 2 points of silver light ignited in the far corner, fixing on her. They weren't the mindless glowing embers of a monster. They were eyes, intelligent, aware, and filled with a pain so profound it stole her breath. Slowly, her own eyes adjusted to the gloom. She could make out a shape, massive and dark, huddled against the far wall. It was a wolf, a Lycan, larger than any horse, its fur the color of storm clouds and matted with filth, and something dark that looked like dried blood. A thick, cruel-looking iron collar was clasped around its neck, attached to a heavy chain bolted to the stone. One of its legs was twisted at an unnatural angle. It made no move to attack. It didn't growl or snarl. It just watched her, its great head resting on its paws, its silver eyes tracking her every breath. The rattling sound came again, and she realized it was its breathing. Each inhale was a struggle. It was starving. And it was hurt. Without thinking, she unlatched the heavy door. The guards were gone, seeking the warmth of the lower guard room. No one would know. It was a foolish, suicidal impulse, born of a moment of shared misery. The door groaned open on ancient hinges. The smell of pain and wildness washed over her. She took one step inside, then another. The air was frigid, colder than the stairway. The wolf did not move, but its silver eyes widened slightly. It could have lunged, could have torn her throat out before she could scream, but it remained still, a statue of suffering. She walked slowly to the center of the cell, her worn leather shoes making no sound on the filthy straw. She sat down on the floor, crossing her thin legs. The cold of the stone was a shock, even through her clothes. She unwrapped the bread and cheese from its cloth. She broke off a piece of the bread. "I don't have much," she whispered, her voice a raw, unused thing. "But they forgot you." She held the piece of bread out on her flat palm. The wolf watched her hand. Its nostrils flared, catching the scent. A low rumble started in its chest, but it wasn't a growl of aggression. It was something else, a sound of deep, aching need. It pushed itself up, its injured leg buckling. It limped towards her, dragging the heavy chain. Each step was an agony. It moved with a deliberateness that spoke of immense control, of a will fighting against instinct. It stopped just out of reach, its massive head level with her own. Its silver eyes searched her face, looking for a trick, a trap. She saw centuries of caution in that gaze. She didn't move. She kept her hand steady, her heart hammering but her expression calm. She knew what it was like to be offered something only to have it snatched away. She wouldn't do that. Slowly, with infinite care, the great wolf lowered its head. Its wet nose nudged her palm, and then its soft lips delicately lifted the bread from her skin. Its teeth, long and sharp as daggers, never once touched her. It swallowed the morsel in a single gulp and looked at her again, a silent question in its eyes. She broke off another piece, and then the cheese. She fed it all to the beast, piece by piece, until her own dinner was gone. When the last crumb was eaten, it did not leave. It lay down before her, its head on its paws, the tip of its nose almost touching her knee. It let out a long, shuddering sigh, and the tension seemed to drain from its powerful body. She found herself reaching out, her hand moving as if with a will of its own. She laid her palm on the top of its great head, between its ears. The fur was thick but coarse. Beneath it, she could feel a faint, feverish heat and a tremor of pain that ran through its whole body. Instead of flinching away, the wolf leaned into her touch, a soft whine escaping its throat. It closed its silver eyes, and in the cold, dark, forgotten cell, Alara sat with the monster, sharing her bread, and for the first time in her life, she was not afraid. She was not a scullion. She was not nothing. She was the girl who fed the beast, and the beast had trusted her. She came back every night. The kitchens, busy with the solstice aftermath, barely noticed her, and the guards had grown complacent. She brought her own meager rations, sharing them as she had that first night. She would sit on the cold floor, and the great wolf would lay its head in her lap while it ate. She talked to it, whispering stories of her life, the small gray details of an orphan's existence. She didn't know if it understood, but it listened, its silver eyes fixed on her face. She learned its rhythms, the way its breathing hitched when the pain in its leg grew worse, the low growl that was not a threat, but a sound of contentment when she scratched behind its ears. She brought a bucket of clean water and a rag one night and gently cleaned the grime from its fur. It let her, standing with a patience that was profoundly humbling. The wounds beneath were old, scars layered on top of scars. One night, a week after the first, the moon was a perfect silver disk in the sky, its light pouring through the high, barred window. The wolf was restless. It paced the length of its chain, its breath coming in ragged pants. The whine it made was sharp, filled with a new kind of agony. She was afraid then. The stories of the full moon, of the beast's rage, came rushing back. But she didn't run. She sat in her usual spot and waited. The wolf stopped its pacing and looked at her. It limped over and collapsed, laying its head in her lap, its whole body trembling violently. A guttural cry was torn from its throat, a sound of such torment that tears sprang to Alara's eyes. She wrapped her arms around its thick neck, holding on as it convulsed. She felt a shift, a terrible, grinding change in the bones beneath her hands. The fur seemed to recede, the great muzzle shortening. The sound it made was no longer a howl, but a human scream of pure agony. She held on tighter, burying her face in its neck, whispering soothing words she didn't know she had. The transformation was brutal and swift. When the shaking stopped, it was not a wolf that lay panting in her lap. It was a man. He was naked, his body lean and corded with muscle but gaunt, as if he hadn't eaten a full meal in years. Scars, pale and silver in the moonlight, crisscrossed his skin, a map of old battles. The cruel iron collar was still around his neck, a brutal contrast to the vulnerability of his human form. His hair was long and black, the color of a raven's wing, stuck to his sweat-slicked brow. He pushed himself up slowly, his movements stiff with pain. The broken chains hung from his wrists. He looked at his own hands, then at her, and his eyes. They were the same intelligent, soul-weary silver eyes of the wolf. Alara's breath caught in her throat. She knew that face. She had seen it on coins, on banners. Cold, harsh, and beautiful. It was the face of the Alpha King, Kalen. He stared at her, not with rage, but with a profound, world-shattering shock. His lips parted, but no sound came out. He looked from her face to the empty cloth that had held her bread, then back to her. The king in the cell. The beast she had fed. It was him. It had always been him. You. He finally breathed, his voice a raw rasp, like stones grinding together. It was a voice that had commanded armies, and it was filled with utter disbelief. She couldn't speak. She could only stare, her world tilting on its axis. The monster, the weapon, the beast, was her king, and she had been sitting in his cell, sharing her food with him, stroking his head as he lay in her lap. He flinched, pulling away from her, scrambling backward until his back hit the cold stone wall. He tried to hide his nakedness, a sudden sharp shame in his silver eyes, the all-powerful Alpha King, cowering in a corner of his own dungeon. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice gaining a sliver of its command. "Alara," she whispered. I work in the kitchens." He closed his eyes, a muscle working in his jaw. "The girl who feeds the beast." He said it not as a title, but as a curse, a truth he could not comprehend. "You should have run. You were hurt," she said simply, as if that explained everything. His eyes snapped open. "I could have killed you, 100 times. I could kill you now." The threat was there, but his voice held no heat. It was brittle, fragile. She looked at him, truly looked at the man. She saw the exhaustion etched around his eyes, the deep lines of pain. She saw the way his ribs stood out, the tremor in his hands. He was not a threat. He was a prisoner, same as she was, trapped by a different kind of chain. "No," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "You wouldn't." His stare was intense, searching. He was reading her, trying to understand how this slip of a girl could sit before him without screaming, how she could look at him with something that was not fear, but pity. A cold draft swept through the cell, and he shivered, the motion violent and uncontrollable. He was freezing. Without a word, Alara stood, took off her own thin woolen cloak, and walked toward him. He tensed, his body coiling like a spring, a low growl rumbling in his chest. It was a human sound, but the feral warning was unmistakable. She didn't stop. She knelt before him and draped the cloak over his broad, scarred shoulders. Her fingers brushed the cold skin of his collarbone. It was like touching ice. A deep, unnatural cold that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. It was a cold that radiated from within him, a chill that felt like death. He gasped at her touch, his eyes widening. "You're warm," he whispered, as if the concept was foreign to him. She pulled the cloak tighter around him. "You're freezing, Your Majesty." The title sounded absurd in the filth of the cell. He let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "Majesty? Look at me. This is my kingdom, a collar and a chain." "Why?" she asked, the question escaping before she could stop it. "Why are you here?" He looked away, his gaze falling on the chain still dangling from his wrists. "A curse. An old one. The beast. My wolf. It is not a part of me. It is a passenger. A thing of pure rage. My ancestor angered a Fey queen, and this was her price. With every generation the wolf grows stronger and the man weaker. I cannot control it. So I cage it. I cage myself." He looked back at her, his silver eyes bleak. "I haven't let it out in years, but it grows stronger. It starves, and so I starve. It weakens, and so I weaken. Soon, it will break these chains. It will break me, and it will destroy everything." That was the secret of the Alpha King. His immense power was a lie. He was a dying man, locked in a battle with his own soul. "It didn't hurt me," she said softly. "It was gentle." "Because you are different," he said, shaking his head in confusion. "My beast has known nothing but rage for a century. It should have torn you apart, but it laid its head in your lap." He looked at her as if she were a puzzle he couldn't solve. "What are you?" "I'm no one," she said, the old, familiar shame washing over her. "No," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You are not." He reached out, his hand trembling, and his fingers brushed her cheek. His touch was freezing, a ghost of a caress, but it sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold. It was the first gentle touch she had known in her life. The next morning, the castle was in an uproar. The king had been seen. Not in the throne room, but emerging from the forbidden North Tower, looking gaunt and terrible, but undeniably alive. He had summoned his council. Alara was scrubbing pots, her mind a world away, when two royal guards entered the kitchens. Their polished armor gleamed, and the head cook dropped a ladle with a clatter. They walked past the cooks, past the maids, their eyes scanning the room. They stopped in front of her. "Alara, of the kitchens," one of them stated, his voice booming. "By order of the Alpha King, you are to come with us." A wave of fear washed over her. He was going to silence her. The secret was too great. She was going to the dungeons, but a different one this time. One she would not leave. She was taken not to a cell, but to a suite of rooms high in the main keep. They were larger than the entire kitchen. A fire roared in the hearth, and the bed was piled high with furs. A wardrobe stood open, filled with gowns of velvet and silk. "These are your chambers," the guard said, his face unreadable. "You are to be the king's personal attendant. You will answer only to him." She stood, stunned, in the middle of the room. An attendant. He wasn't killing her. He was keeping her close, keeping his secret safe. Later that day, he came. He was dressed now in black leather and fine wool, the clothes of a king. He looked stronger, but the haunted look in his silver eyes remained. With him was an older man with a severe face and shrewd eyes, Lord Valerius, the king's most trusted advisor. "Lord Valerius, this is Alara," Kaelin said, his voice cold and formal. "She will be attending to my personal needs." Valerius looked her up and down, a flicker of disdain in his eyes. "A scullion, Your Majesty? An unusual choice." "My choice is not for you to question," Kaelin said, his tone sharp as glass. Valerius bowed his head, but his eyes, when they met Alara's, were full of suspicion. He knew something was wrong with this picture. When the advisor was gone, Kaelin's formal mask dropped. He ran a hand through his dark hair, the exhaustion returning. "This is not a reward," he said, his voice low. "It is a necessity. You know what I am. I cannot risk you speaking of it. Here, I can watch you. You will stay in these rooms. You will speak to no one of your duties in the North Tower." "I wouldn't have told anyone," she said quietly. "You say that now," he countered, his voice harsh, "but fear is a powerful motivator." He paced the room, a caged wolf in a different kind of prison. "There are rules. You will not enter my chambers unless summoned. You will not touch me, and when the moon is full, you will lock your door and speak to no one until sunrise. Do you understand?" The boundary was clear, a wall of ice between them. This was an arrangement, nothing more. A way to contain a dangerous secret. "Yes, Your Majesty," she whispered. He stopped pacing and looked at her. The coldness in his eyes softened for a fraction of a second. "The beast. It is calm when you are near. I can feel it. It is quiet for the first time in my life." He looked confused, almost frightened by the admission. "I don't know why, but it is another reason you must stay. Your presence is a balm." And so her new life began. A life of gilded imprisonment. She had fine clothes she was afraid to wear, and rich food that tasted like ash in her mouth. The court whispered. They saw a kitchen maid plucked from obscurity, and they assumed the obvious. They called her the king's pet, his whore. Their words were sharp, but they were nothing compared to the cold loneliness of her beautiful rooms. She saw Kalen every day. She brought him his meals, which he barely touched. She saw the tremor in his hands as he tried to sign documents, the sheen of sweat on his brow even in the cold castle. The curse was a constant drain on him, a parasite eating him from the inside out. She saw past the cold mask he wore for the court. She saw the man who shivered in the dark. One night she found him in his study, slumped over his desk, a goblet of wine untouched beside him. His breathing was shallow. She forgot his rule about not touching him. She placed her hand on his shoulder. He flinched violently but didn't pull away. "Leave me," he rasped. "You're in pain," she said. "I am always in pain," he bit back. Her hand remained. Through his tunic she could feel that deep, unnatural cold. But as she kept her hand there, she felt something else. A flicker of warmth. Not from him, but from her. It was faint, like the heat from a distant candle, but it was there. She felt it travel from her palm into his shoulder. He stiffened. He slowly sat up and looked at her, his silver eyes wide with a new kind of shock. What was that?" "What was what?" she asked, confused. "The warmth," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I felt it. For a moment, the cold. It receded." He stared at her hand on his shoulder as if it were some magical artifact. She didn't understand. She was just a girl. There was nothing special about her, but she didn't pull her hand away. And for a long time they sat in silence, the king and the scullion, and a fragile bridge of warmth began to form over the icy chasm between them. The intimacy grew in these stolen moments, a shared silence in the study, his eyes following her as she stoked the fire. Her leaving a cup of hot broth by his door when she knew the pain was bad. The boundaries he had set were eroding, worn away by a current of unspoken understanding. He was a king breaking under the weight of his crown, and she was the only one who saw the cracks. Lord Valerius saw them too. He saw the way the king's eyes would soften when Alara entered a room. He saw the slight easing of the tension in Kalen's shoulders. He had spent years carefully managing the king's curse, using it to consolidate his own power, whispering in the ear of a ruler too consumed by his own battle to rule effectively. This girl, this nobody, was a threat to all of it. She was making the king stronger. Or perhaps, Valerius schemed, she was agitating the beast. A weakness to be exploited. The night of the next full moon arrived like a death sentence. The air in the castle was thick with dread. Alara could feel it, a low hum of energy that made the hairs on her arms stand up. She remembered Kaelin's warning, "Lock your door." She was in her chambers, her hand on the bolt, when a knock came. It was one of Valerius's personal guards. "The king requires you," the guard said, his face a stony mask. "He is in his chambers. He seems unwell." A cold spear of fear shot through her. Kaelin had been worse all day, the cold radiating from him in waves. She had seen him stumble in the corridor, catching himself on the wall, his face pale and slick with sweat. She shouldn't go. He had forbidden it. But the thought of him in pain, alone, it was stronger than his command. She followed the guard. He led her to the king's chambers and opened the door for her. "He is within." She stepped inside. The room was dark, the heavy curtains drawn. The only light came from the dying embers in the massive stone fireplace. "Your Majesty?" she called out softly. There was no answer. Only a low, guttural sound from the far side of the room, a sound she recognized from the cell. Behind her, the door clicked shut. The heavy sound of a bolt sliding home echoed in the sudden silence. A trap. "Kaelin," she whispered, her voice trembling. A figure emerged from the shadows near the bed. It was him. He was stripped to the waist, his scarred torso gleaming faintly. His body was rigid, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. His head was thrown back, and a scream of pure, unadulterated agony was torn from his throat. "Run!" he ground out, his teeth clenched so hard she was afraid they would shatter. "Valerius! Damn him! Get out, Alara, now!" But there was nowhere to run. The door was barred. The windows were stories from the ground. He fell to his knees, his back arching. The sound of bones snapping and reforming filled the room. It was happening again. The brutal, violent transformation. But this was different. This was not the weary, starving wolf from the cell. This was the full, untamed power of the beast, fueled by the moon, breaking free after years of suppression. His screams became a roar. Fur, black as midnight, sprouted from his skin. His face elongated into a feral muzzle, his silver eyes burning with a terrifying, mindless light. The Lycan that stood before her was a nightmare. It was larger, its muscles coiled with explosive power, its claws like razors. This was the monster of the stories, the rage-filled weapon. And she was locked in a room with it. It turned its massive head and its burning eyes found her. A low, predatory growl rumbled in its chest, a sound that shook the very floorboards. It took a step towards her, its lips peeling back to reveal teeth like a row of daggers. There was no recognition in its eyes, no memory of the girl who shared her bread. There was only the curse, only hunger and rage. Alara backed away until she hit the cold stone of the wall. Her heart was a wild bird trapped in her chest, beating itself to death against her ribs. This was it. This was how she died. Devoured by the very creature she had tried to save. The beast stalked towards her, low to the ground, a predator closing in on its prey. She could smell the raw power coming off it, the scent of blood and moonlit fury. It was 10 feet away. 5. She closed her eyes, bracing for the tearing pain. A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. "Kaelin," she whispered, his name a final prayer. The name seemed to strike it like a physical blow. The Lycan paused. It shook its great head, a flicker of confusion in its burning gaze. It let out a whine, a sound of internal conflict. It was still there. Kaelin was still in there, fighting. It took another step, and then another, until its hot, foul breath washed over her face. It opened its jaws, ready to strike. But then it hesitated again. It lowered its head, its snout inches from her throat, and inhaled deeply. It smelled her, the scent of bread and kindness and the faint, inexplicable warmth that was her alone. The beast reared back, howling in agony. It wasn't a howl of rage, but of torment. It clawed at its own chest, deep gouges appearing in its thick hide, blood welling dark and hot. The curse wanted her dead. The wolf, the soul of the beast she had befriended, remembered her. And Kalen, the man, was being torn apart by the two. It collapsed onto the floor, its massive body convulsing. The rage in its eyes was being consumed by a greater agony. It was dying. The curse, denied its violent release, was turning inward, devouring its host. The internal conflict was a poison, and it was killing him. She saw it in its eyes, a desperate plea. Help me. Fear was a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but something else rose to meet it. Not courage, not strength. Just a simple, profound refusal to let him die alone in the dark. She had found him in the dark once before. She would not abandon him now. She pushed herself off the wall, her legs shaking so badly she could barely stand. She walked towards the dying monster, the thing that had been about to tear her to pieces. She knelt beside its heaving, blood-soaked form. It was shuddering, its breaths coming in ragged, wet gasps. The silver light in its eyes was fading, being replaced by the flat, dull look of death. "It's all right," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm here." She reached out her trembling hands and laid them on its fur, right over the terrible, self-inflicted wounds on its chest. She felt the frantic, failing beat of his heart beneath her palms. She felt the last of his strength leaving him. She closed her eyes and poured every ounce of her will, her grief, her desperate refusal to lose him, into that touch. "No," she whispered, "I will not let you go." And then it happened. The warmth she had felt before, the flicker of a distant candle, erupted. It was not a flicker now. It was a flood, a torrent of pure golden light that blazed from her hands, from her very soul. It was the light of 1,000 sunrises, the heat of a summer field, the energy of life itself. It poured out of her, a silent, radiant explosion. The light sank into the Lycan's body. The curse, a thing of cold and ancient shadow, recoiled from it with a silent psychic scream. The beast's convulsions stopped. The terrible wounds on its chest began to close, the skin knitting back together under her hands, leaving no scars. The rage in its eyes vanished, replaced completely by the clear, intelligent silver of Kalen's gaze. It looked at her, its eyes wide with awe and disbelief, and then the transformation began to reverse. It wasn't the violent, bone-breaking agony of before. The fur receded like a retreating tide. The monstrous forms softened, shrinking, reforming smoothly, gently, guided by the golden light. It was a healing, not a battle. When the light faded, Kalen lay on the floor, human and whole. The scars that had mapped his body were gone. The deep, unnatural cold that had plagued him for centuries was gone, replaced by a simple, human warmth. The iron collar of the curse which had been fused to his very soul had vanished as if it had never been. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the first easy breath he had taken in his life. He pushed himself up onto his elbows and stared at her, his face a mask of wonder. "Ilara," he breathed. She collapsed beside him, the energy leaving her in a rush, leaving her weak and trembling but alive. He crawled to her, pulling her into his arms. His skin was warm against hers. He held her tightly, burying his face in her hair, his shoulders shaking. "You saved me," he whispered against her skin. "The cold. It's gone. I can feel everything." He pulled back to look at her, his silver eyes shining with unshed tears. "All my life I've been half dead, a ghost in my own skin. You brought me back." "I couldn't let you die," she said, her own tears finally falling. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently wiping her tears away. "It was always you, my mate. The other half of my soul, the cure to my curse. I was too blind, too lost in the pain to see it." He leaned in and pressed his forehead against hers. "I love you, Ilara. I think I have since the moment you offered me your bread." The words settled into her heart, healing places she didn't even know were broken. She, the scullion, the nothing girl, was his everything. "I love you," she answered, the truth of it blooming inside her, chasing away the last of her own shadows. At that moment, the door to the chamber burst open. Lord Valerius stood there, flanked by a dozen royal guards, a look of triumphant horror on his face, ready to show the world the king's monstrosity. He stopped dead. The scene before him was not the bloodbath he had engineered. There was no monster. There was only his king, whole and vibrant, holding a girl in his arms who seemed to faintly glow with a residual golden light. The air in the room was not filled with the stench of blood, but with a palpable sense of peace and power. Kaelin looked up, and the eyes that met Valerius's were not the haunted, pain-filled eyes of the man he had manipulated for years. They were the clear silver eyes of a true Alpha King, blazing with a cold, absolute fury. "Valerius," Kaelin said, his voice quiet, but carrying the weight of an avalanche, "you came to see a monster." He stood, pulling Alara up with him, shielding her with his body. He was no longer just a man. Power radiated from him, the pure, untainted power of his bloodline, finally free. "You will get your wish." For the first time, Kaelin shifted by choice. It was nothing like the curse. It was a seamless, fluid motion, a breathtaking display of power. He grew, his form expanding, covered in a coat of magnificent silver fur. The wolf that stood there was not the gaunt, tortured creature from the cell, nor the raging Lycan. It was a king of wolves, immense and beautiful, its eyes glowing with intelligence and righteous wrath. Valerius and his guards stumbled back, their faces white with terror. They had come to cage a beast and had found themselves facing a god. The treacherous advisor's fate was swift and merciless. Justice, for the first time in a long time, reigned in the castle. 6 months passed. Winter had given way to a vibrant spring, and the castle, once a place of cold stone and whispered fears, felt alive. The change was more than just the season. It was Alara. She was no longer the king's pet. She was the Luna Queen, his mate, his partner in rule. Her quiet kindness and the strange life-giving warmth that now flowed from her at will had transformed the court. Plants bloomed in the castle gardens with unnatural vibrancy. Wounds healed faster under her care. Hope, a long-forgotten weed, had taken root and was flourishing. She learned to control her gift, this hidden power of life she never knew she possessed. It was a part of her bloodline, a dormant magic awakened by love and sacrifice. She was the sun to Kaelin's moon, the warmth to his winter. Kaelin was a different man. The haunted look was gone, replaced by a calm strength that settled the fears of his people. He ruled with a wisdom and decisiveness he'd never been able to access before, his mind finally clear of the curse's shadow. He never chained himself again. His wolf was a part of him now, a magnificent silver creature that would often be seen walking at Alara's side through the castle grounds, as tame as a lamb with her, but with the power of a tempest in its eyes for any who might threaten her. One evening, they stood on the balcony of their chambers, the same room where she had nearly died, now a sanctuary of their love. The full moon, once a harbinger of agony, was rising, a beautiful silver disk in the twilight sky. It held no more fear for them. Kaelin wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. He was warm, always warm now. "Do you remember the first time I saw you?" He murmured into her hair. "Truly saw you, in the cell. I thought I was dreaming. An angel had walked into my hell. I thought you were a monster," she confessed, leaning back against his strong chest. "But you just looked lonely." "I was," he said. "I was alone for centuries, waiting for you. I just didn't know it." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "You fed a starving beast, Alara. You shared the only thing you had." It was just a piece of bread, she whispered. No, he said, his voice thick with emotion as he turned her to face him. He took her hand, the one that had offered him that first kindness, and raised it to his lips. It was everything. In his silver eyes she no longer saw a king or a beast. She saw her mate, her partner, the other half of her soul. She had been a girl with nothing, and he had been a king with a monstrous secret. But together, in the darkness of a forgotten cell, they had found their kingdom. They had saved each other. And their new world, bathed in the gentle light of the moon, was just beginning.